Hello and welcome to another tutorial. We are looking at the expressions and statements in Java source code. And we say that statements are roughly equivalent to sentences in the natural language. And I mentioned this in the previous lectures that a statement is any line of code that terminates with a semicolon. Now you can have multiple statements in one line of code. That's just because the Java compiler doesn't care. It just searches for where basically a line is terminated with semicolon, and then it assumes that that's the whole statement. A statement forms a complete unit of execution. The following types of expressions can be made into a statement by terminating the expression with a semicolon. Now, assignment of expressions, we said that assignment expressions or the assignment operator evaluates the right hand side of the assignment first, and then return value is assigned to the left hand side. Obviously the types should match or be able to implicitly convert the right hand side type to the left hand. Postfix and prefix increment or decrement notations, we saw that we can just say x plus plus semicolon, that's a valid statement, or plus plus x semicolon, that's a valid statement. Now in this case we know that these operators have a return value. When you say x plus plus or plus plus x and then semicolon, you're telling the Java compiler, I don't care about the return value of this expression or a statement that is being evaluated, just increment the x, right? Method invocation, in a statement you can just invoke a method. The method might have a return value. If you don't assign it to anything, you're basically telling the compiler, I don't care about the return value, just execute this method and come back. Object creation expressions, the new operator, you can create a new object and then assign it to an object reference or pointer. Such statements are called expression statements. Here are some examples of expression statements. So the assignment statement, remember a statement is anything that is terminated with semicolon. You can have multiple statements in one line in your source code, that's fine. Obviously it's recommended, or the best practice is put each statement that terminates with a semicolon on one line in your source code. And if you're in Eclipse, if you hit the Command Shift F, it has the auto formatting and it properly formats your code, right? A value plus plus, this is an increment statement. And again, what we're saying here is that I don't care about the return value of this expression, just increment the A. System.out.println hello world, this is a statement, and we said that this statement actually has two expressions. One is a string literal, and then the other expression is the method invocation for print line. Object creation, bicycle, my bike equals new bicycle, so it's again terminated with semicolon. So that's a full statement. And again, the best practice is to put each statement on one line of source code. The Java compiler doesn't care, JVM doesn't care, because after your source code is compiled to bytecode, then semicolon, these things don't exist in bytecode, right? Bytecode are just instructions for the JVM. But the best practice in terms of the readability is to put each statement on one line of code. In addition to expression statements, there are two other kinds of statements: declaration statements and control flow statements. A declaration statement declares a variable. You have seen many examples of the declaration statements already. For example, double a value equals this number, which is by it's a floating point literal, and if you don't specify f, a suffix f, which means it's by default a double or 64-bit floating point literal, right? We said that the default floating point type for literals in Java is 64-bit double values. So this is a declaration. You are declaring a variable and then you immediately initialize it, and this is called the basically definition of the variable. When you define a variable, you declare its type, so you give it a name, you declare its type, but then you also initialize it with some value, so you fully define it for the JVM. Now if you just say double a value semicolon, you're still declaring a variable, but it can, if it's a local variable in the method, it's not initialized. If it's a field of your class, which means it's a member variable of your class, it gets initialized to default value in terms of double zero, right? Now obviously in C++ it has a garbage value, so the compiler doesn't initialize it, but in Java we said that fields of a class or member variables of a class get initialized to default value if you don't initialize it when you declare them. Finally, control flow statements regulate the order in which statements get executed. We've seen if statements, else if statements. We've seen the ternary operator, which is equivalent to a if-else statement. You will learn about control flow statements in the next section, control flow statements. So this comes right after this. So as I mentioned, if, for example, if I go here in our previous discussions, we can have basically multiple statements in one line of code. Again, Java compiler doesn't care about this. As long as you terminate with semicolon, you're telling the Java compiler, this is one statement, this is one statement, and this is one statement. And white spaces don't matter to the Java compiler, and then you can have multiple statements on one line of code. Obviously, programming languages like Python, they do care about white spaces and the order of lines and how you write your source code. But Java doesn't care because compiler takes care of all these white spaces and semicolons. But the semicolons matter. If I remove the semicolon, then this has a weird meaning. And to the compiler, it says that, hey, you're saying that you're invoking this method, but then you're suddenly jumping to int I equal 3, and this is an illegal statement. Now, what's interesting is that the compiler is smart enough to tell you that, hey, you probably meant to add a semicolon here. So Eclipse compiler is very smart. It also gives you a red underline saying that, yeah, you probably need to terminate this first, so that it has a full meaning. It's a meaningful expression, and then the next one is also a meaningful expression, right? And as I mentioned, in Eclipse or any IDE that you choose, they usually provide some formatting, auto formatting, and you can also define how to do it. So in Eclipse, if you go to preferences, and then I believe in the Java, and then code style, and then formatter, then you can create I'm using a Eclipse built-in. You can create your own, and then go ahead and edit. It has lots and lots of things. For example, indentation, what rules to follow, and then brace position. Do you want to, now the convention is Java is to put the opening brace or opening curly brackets in the first line as you define your stuff, and then the closing one in the next line. Now, in, for example, C++, the convention is to put both of them in the next line, so you don't put a brace right at the end of your definition. But in Java, the convention is this, and Eclipse by default follows these guidelines. However, you can basically customize everything that you want. It has lots and lots of formatting tools, declarations for the white spaces. How do you want to do this? And then when you this formatter, basically what happens here is that basically when you save your profile and then basically create your own formatter style, and then you say that Command Shift F, it automatically formats it based on the current formatting profile, right? So you create your profile, and then whenever you say Command Shift F on Mac, or in Windows, Control Shift F, and then it applies all the rules that you define this formatter. And to show you, for example, let's create a new formatter. I'm going to say my formatter, and then it says initial settings with the following profile. So I want to start with the default settings, right? And then I want to, let's say, braces positions, right? I want to say what happens, method declaration. I want to say that put the whenever I have a method. So here's the record, this class, this is a method, void foo. So this only applies to methods. For example, here in my source code, I have a static method, right? So you can define how it behaves for methods only, for enums, constructor declaration. It's very comprehensive. So let's hit this, and you see the example here. In the class definition, the opening brace is going to be on the same line, same for the constructor definition, but for every method, it puts the curly brackets on the next line, and it only applies to the method. So let's run this. So if I hit Command Shift F, as you can see, all the methods now following this guideline. So I highly recommend you start with your IDE and then define your own formatting styles. Some companies ask you to follow their specific guideline or formatting guideline. It's always good if people collaborate on the same project, they all follow the same formatting style. That's very good. And you see all the methods now follow this, whereas the class definition didn't follow that rule, because I decided to go with the default, which means the curly brace is on the same line. However, for the methods, I decided to go with the style that the opening curly brace or opening bracket is on the next line. And Eclipse automatically took care of this for me. That's a very nice thing. So I'm going to go back and switch to the default Eclipse setting. Right, actually I'm going to so Eclipse built-in. So I'm going to go back, and now if I hit Command Shift F, it's going to correctly format this. Now if you want part of your code to not be subject to formatting, I believe Eclipse has some sort of if we click on the formatter off on tag, so Eclipse has this tag. If you add a comment with the tag formatter off, then you actually tell it whatever comes after that, don't apply these formatting rules until you get to the closing tag that turns the formatter on, right? So you can also define what kind of tag to use. I usually prefer the default tag @formatter off on. So you selectively change it off and on. So let me go back to my formatter again. So if I hit Command Shift F, it's going to format my methods. Let's do a undo it, and then now I'm going to create a comment @formatter off. So if I do this and Command Shift F, you see what happens here is that it applies to whatever that comes after or before this turning the formatter off. But everything after this tag, which is a comment, so it doesn't basically affect your source code, but it's just something internal to the Eclipse. That's why you have to use as comment, because Java compiler doesn't understand this tag. But then it didn't apply to these methods. Now I can actually turn the formatter @formatter on, turn it back on. Now so formatting is not going to be applied to this part of my code. So if I hit Command Shift F, it's going to apply to this part again. As you can see, it happened. So this is the formatter in Eclipse. I highly recommend you define your own style, the style that best suit you, and then stick with that. And then whenever there's part of your code that you don't want it to be subject to formatting, just use this tag and turn the formatting off and on this particular piece of code in your source code. Now the other thing is that when you hit Command Shift F, it only applies the style to the current source file, the Java file that you're in. And I believe there are options to apply the formatting to your entire project. I'm not sure where the actual so format. So if you click select your project source format, it probably applies the formatting to your to all the source codes in your project. So that's something that you can do quickly to format your code, right? So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.